Hello everyone, Cole Anderson here again with another installment of The Independent Pianist. This week I wanted to address an issue that's been on my mind for a while now, which is of course the question of the real positive and negative effects that music schools have on future professional musicians. So I'm going to start today with a little bit of background info on myself. So if you want to skip that and just go straight to the list of problems that I have with music schools, just go down to the description and you can find all the timestamps in there you can click on to skip through. So first off, I do want to apologize for my title. I know it's a little bit of a clickbait title. Needless to say, all my feelings about music schools are not negative. In fact, I myself went about as far through the music school system as is possible. When I was in high school, I went to a wonderful pre-college conservatory, the Seattle Conservatory, which is still in operation, and it's a wonderful resource for young musicians in the Seattle area. And after that, at first, I was really hesitant about going to a music school. Certainly the experience had its ups and downs, but in the end, I think it was definitely a good thing for me. I went to Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio to get my bachelor's, and then I went just up the road to the University of Michigan, where I finished up with 2 master's degrees, one in solo performance and one in chamber music performance, and of course, the big one, the doctorate in piano performance, which took about 3 years to get the doctorate. So as I said, I think this was a very positive experience in the long run. When I think just of all the people that I met as a result of doing these degrees, the contacts that I made, the experience that I gained with performing, I mean, I've probably had hundreds of performances, both as a soloist and as a collaborative musician, as a result of doing these degrees. Having these degrees, particularly the doctorate, also does translate to my being able to command higher fees for my work, and also more intangibly, it just gives me more confidence in myself, I think, having had all this experience. Now, having said that, there are certain things that I do feel equivocal about in my experience going through music schools, and there are some things that I've been noticing lately as well about the way in which the academic environment affects students for good and ill that I want to talk about. I think they're very important. First, just from my own personal experience, there was an immediate need to adjust to the much greater level of competitiveness that I found in the music school environment. There was a constant feeling that you were compared to your peers. Everyone was kind of jockeying for a position. It always felt like everyone was trying to show off, to impress the faculty as much as possible, win competitions, basically to prove that they were special, that they were the next up-and-coming big star, that they were somehow different from everyone else. And this was encouraged tacitly by the very nature of things. Your performing opportunities were usually going to be found in inter-department competitions or departmental recitals with different students lined up to perform one after the other. I don't think it's an entirely healthy environment, this kind of hothouse atmosphere. And it certainly was a very exhausting kind of feeling to be exposed to all the time. It had a negative effect on my confidence as a musician at that point in time. I can say that with certainty. I was not the most obviously gifted pianist at that point. In particular, I felt insecure about my technical equipment. During my teen years, I had always focused more on sight reading, exploring new repertoire, big picture musical ideas, color, sound, things like that. I was fascinated by older recordings by great artists like Cortot, Rachmaninoff, Moisevich, Hess, etc. that a lot of people didn't even know when I went to music school. It kind of felt like a weird disconnect, like everyone was really concerned with very different things than what I had been interested in. And I certainly started to work on my technique with great intensity by the time I was, 15 or 16 or so, but I was really behind by the time I got to Oberlin. So it was an immediate setback for me. I felt like I got kind of bogged down, like I had difficulty finding the right path forward to really improve my playing. And I notice it clearly when I look back at recordings that I made from those days, how introverted and shy my playing was. It's very different from how I play now. It became kind of recessed, kind of timid. And I think this atmosphere might also have been exaggerated because of the nature of Oberlin, of course. So Oberlin is a wonderful place in its own way. One teacher referred to it as an oasis of culture in the midst of the cornfields of Middle America. And that's pretty accurate. It's a minuscule town. I mean, there's like 2 streets in the town. A very cute little, teeny little town. And it has this top-tier college and conservatory kind of sprawling around it. And even though it's a highly stimulating and enriching environment, the insularity of its position can't really be denied. I mean, you can't avoid it. I noticed that many people really just got too much in their own heads, and there was a tendency, I think, for people to get an exaggerated feeling of their own importance in the context of the wider musical world. It was still a great experience in many ways. That's really where I got my footing as a performer of collaborative repertoire as well. And then it was only really when I got to Michigan that I was able to gradually start building up my confidence, until when I went through my doctorate, I started to feel like, okay, I'm not a big star, I'm not winning the Tchaikovsky competition or whatever, but maybe I have something of my own to say about music and what the experience of living with music and sharing music could really look like. And maybe that's just as important as winning competitions and showing off. I mean, not in so many words, but it was kind of a nascent feeling that was coming up at that time. And this was partly because there was a much more intellectually stimulating atmosphere at Michigan, at this kind of enormous school, which, unlike Oberlin, also included graduate students, so people who were much older and had already started having to face the realities of surviving in the real world, so to speak. I think what a lot of people in undergrad, particularly in a place like Oberlin where there are no graduate students, don't really realize is that it's such a small percentage of the music making population that actually makes it to these kind of top tier professional situations like concertizing like Lang Lang or Yuzhao Wang or Marc-Andre Hamelin or anyone else that you would name in that kind of position. That's a very small percentage. And very talented people oftentimes just don't get the breaks to make it to that kind of position, or else that kind of lifestyle just doesn't quite suit them exactly, For whatever reason, it doesn't mean that you're not talented or that you don't have something to contribute to the world through music. It just means that you don't fit that teeny little niche of kind of competition-winning, huge recital career pianists. And I think far more people got that once they were in graduate school, and they kind of were having to face the reality of being finished with school and having to make a living. They really got that and were trying to kind of fit themselves into the world, and you could kind of sense that. And so it felt okay to not be, overperforming all the time. So finally I got into my doctorate. I mean, that was an exhausting degree. I ended up getting pretty burned out by the end. But in the 6 years or so since I finished that degree, I've noticed that the things that I started figuring out during that time have really been able to blossom since I've been on my own, making my way in the world. That really set the stage for the kind of confidence that I have now. Going through that experience gave me the foundation that's led me to a very satisfying place in my own playing and about my feelings about music in general. But I had to go through a lot of difficulties to get to this point. Since I've had to become my own teacher, I've really found ways to synthesize everything that I learned in music schools together, and my playing has coalesced and it's where I'd like it to be, I think. If I had to say what I think is probably the number one danger of being in a structured environment like a music school, it's that people come to rely too heavily on the input of their teachers and on the structure provided to them by the school. Once they were out on their own, I saw this with many people, they really didn't know what to do with themselves creatively. They were kind of lost at sea without the guidance of their teacher constantly being there. And they would end up constantly going back for lessons and seeming to have difficulties structuring their progress and making things happen on their own. So even at the present day, I interact with a lot of musicians, and particularly students, string players and so forth, as part of my work. So to make ends meet, I do a lot of collaborative work. And I've been noticing some things about the music school environment and how it affects the students and their development that are not entirely positive. And I don't always have definite solutions to these problems. I don't know if there are definite solutions that exist. Some things would have to be solved at the administrative level in the universities and conservatories, but they're things that I think every musician should be aware of before they take the plunge and attend a music school or conservatory. You have to really be careful about these things because they can truly mess you up if you are not ready for them. First off, there's a kind of artificial standard of performance that is encouraged in music schools that is quite pernicious. So to give a little story as an example, I was working recently with a very talented, very musically and technically accomplished violinist recording pre-screening recordings for graduate school applications. So these recordings are a pretty intense experience. The student is required to prepare entire movements and pieces, and in this case we were recording just one piece from his program. It was a 20-minute long concerto movement. However, in the twisted nature of these things, there's an unwritten assumption that professors are only going to listen to the first minute and a half or so of each recording, if that, maybe even less. And everyone knows this, it's kind of an unspoken thing, but I've heard professors even say it, express it, some of the more honest ones, that they just don't have time to listen to the whole recordings, they just listen to a minute and they move on. So this very talented musician was reduced to repeating the opening of his concerto again and again and again. Sometimes we did as many as 20 or 30 takes in a day before we finally got to the end of the movement. And obviously there was a disparity between the precision that he developed for the beginning and the quality of his playing towards the end. It couldn't really be otherwise when he went through the beginning so many times and the rest of the concerto comparatively little. So let me stress, to any general audience member, any one of those 30 takes would have sounded amazing, confident, full of power, brilliant sound, daring. So you might ask, why was he re-recording so many times? And actually, I totally understand. He was worried about precise details of intonation in the opening. Details of intonation, by the way, that no top-tier professional violinist playing concerts all over the world, certainly not the professors that he was playing for, would be able to control at such a high level at every performance. There's too much chance involved in this technical minutia for even the most talented and skilled to control at all times under all circumstances. It just doesn't happen. I've never heard a performance in my life by a great artist or an orchestra that didn't have some blemishes in it. The only way that great artists can get blemish-free performances is through multiple takes in the recording studio or multiple live performances coupled with editing, which obviously is not allowed for audition recordings. This is simply a fact, it's how it works. And perhaps people do edit too much. That's a topic for another video, but it does create an artificial standard. Students, like the one I was playing for, feel like they have to try to live up to the perfection of recordings, and I understand it. He wanted to put his best foot forward for this audition. He doesn't want to be disqualified for some small intonation error in the first minute of his recording that the next applicant didn't have, because they did an extra 30 takes to make sure it wasn't there. And let me say that I'm also very sympathetic with the teacher's perspective as well. I mean, what can you do to decide between so many applicants if you have dozens and dozens of applicants to listen to at such a high level, especially when you already have so little time to evaluate? At a certain point, it becomes a matter of picking up on every possible small nuance that would never be important to a real audience's appreciation of a performance. So what do we lose from this kind of system? It's entirely unfair and out of balance. Well, the student loses valuable opportunities to really develop the kind of overall view of the work that is essential for a great artist. They never really develop the kind of flow and focus that comes from grasping a long masterwork in its entirety. Instead, they develop too much of a habit of nitpicking. Nitpicking technical defects is important, definitely, in its place, but it has to be integrated into a greater understanding of the entire composition. Otherwise, this kind of perfectionism is never going to translate into great artistry. So I think this system with pre-screening recordings and auditions and so forth, it's really ridiculous. I think that teachers should have more control over selecting the students that they want to work with. Probably audition recordings should really be done away with. I mean, they're practically useless. The teachers don't have time to listen to dozens of recordings to the extent of actually being able to get a true impression of the personality of each student, and it puts an artificial pressure on the students to perform in a way that they will never use again for any real-life situation. I mean, it's crazy. Personally, I think if you want to study with someone, meet that person face-to-face or face-to-Zoom or whatever, and play for them. If you click and they want you, that should be it. The school should not be imposing these artificial standards by requiring that every teacher's selections have to be approved by a kind of universal voting system, like a competition. And that's how it works. Everyone votes on the applicants based on the recordings or performances that they've heard, 30 seconds of or 5 minutes of in the case of a live audition, and the admissions office makes the final decision, perhaps taking into account the desires of the teachers as much as possible. Instead, universities and conservatories should trust the judgments of the teachers that they employ and let them decide who they want to work with without having to go through this ridiculous rigmarole. It's very inartistic and totally useless, I think. Anyway, it should really be the student who has more of the power here and who is actively trying to find a teacher who aligns with them through hearing their performances and hearing them speak. It's ridiculous, really, how little effort sometimes students put into really making sure that a teacher is a good fit. I mean, this teacher is going to have so much effect on you over your 4 years in undergraduate. You should really make darn certain that you have found someone who fits you and that you want to work with, because it's going to be hard to switch later if you want to. That's another point I need to talk about. So ridiculous thing number 2 in music schools is how politicized they become and how difficult it is to change teachers if a relationship is not working for you. This was something I saw many times, particularly at Oberlin. Students would have a hard time working with a teacher. Perhaps they didn't get to know the teacher well enough, and then they wanted to switch and study with someone else, and it was made difficult for them. The administration made it difficult, the teachers made it difficult. Often they took kind of petty revenges if they could, and it would create bad blood between the teachers. Egos were ruffled. Really, I just have to say to people like this, you need to get over yourselves. We're supposed to be there as teachers to support the students. So if the relationship is not working out, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad teacher. It doesn't mean that other teachers are trying to steal your students. This kind of paranoia is not healthy for you or for anyone. We should try to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Now, actually, it's not always this way, of course. I was very impressed at University of Michigan that both the composition department and the 2 clarinet studios kind of had a system where they could rotate students and kind of share students between the studios. And I thought that was very encouraging. It's certainly a good thing to have a dedicated teacher with whom you form a rapport, but it's also good to be able to get a lot of different perspectives. And I think that our goal really in the end should be for the best possible outcome for the students. And I think that would include being able to get different perspectives from different teachers. I think that would be extremely beneficial for the growth and development of students, so that they're not always hearing the same thing from the same person all the time. Another thing that I really hated about music schools was that there would be this kind of a clique-like feeling that would form, where students of one teacher would form a kind of club, and there would be a lot of trash talking about other studios and students of other teachers. Sometimes it got really nasty. I couldn't believe what people were saying, and totally without basis. And oftentimes the teachers didn't help. They kind of expressed a distrust or were verbal in their reservations about other teachers in a way that wasn't appropriate. Not everyone did this, certainly. None of my teachers were really like that. But again, we're musicians. We should remember that our goal is to bring people together using this universal language. Let's try not to let our baser instincts take control of professional relationships. As a side note, I think it's been taken for granted for far too long that musicians are prima donnas, emotional, paranoid, prickly, and so forth. It's unfortunate that it's oftentimes been true. But I think that if we all can just take a more humanistic view of what art and music is really about, we can really minimize the negative impact that our egos can have on students. As teachers, we should try to set an example of maturity in our relationships with our colleagues. Okay, next bit is end of semester juries. This is kind of related to auditions. I've already spoken about it a bit in a previous video about what a slog it is for professors and needlessly stressful for students, doing these juries where the student comes and plays for 10 minutes for all the professors and they have to listen to days of these things, And really it always seems a little bit useless because if they had been performing, going to lessons with their teachers and in studio classes, departmental recitals, master classes, all of the faculty will have formed an impression of what these students are capable of. Again, I think it's a little bit of a lack of trust in the teachers by the administration. They're trying to kind of structure these things to make sure that no one slips through the cracks who shouldn't be. But, I would prefer if these things were replaced by more opportunities to perform for community, more kind of creative opportunities for performance, which would benefit the students in the long run far more anyway. I know that the most meaningful performances for me in my career were not performances that I did for my peers or for my teachers. It were performances that I did for community members. For instance, at retirement communities. Some of the most beautiful and meaningful comments I ever received were after concerts in quite humble settings. I think it would really benefit college-age musicians to get more experiences like this where they're really playing for music lovers and not other wannabe professionals or teachers. They need to get out of the ivory tower that can sometimes be created in conservatory environments. It really changes the way you approach music making, and it drives home the extent to which this whole experience should really be about giving your talent to people who really need it. Okay, here's another point. This is a huge problem, I think. In music schools, they tend to be completely out of touch, at least when it comes to pianists and oftentimes violinists too. They tend to be completely out of touch with professional reality when it comes to how quickly students are required to learn repertoire, and especially how quickly they're required to memorize. And both things are very damaging, sometimes permanently. I'm definitely going to do a separate video on memory because that's a question. People have lots of questions and misunderstandings about memory, and I've been thinking about it a lot recently. But in short, let's just talk about the way it works in music schools in particular. Students are assigned pieces to learn in a semester generally. They start working at the beginning of the semester. They take these pieces to their lessons. Depending on the teacher, they might even be required to memorize from the very first lesson. They play these pieces in studio classes and in master classes. Maybe they're preparing for their own recital. And at the end of the semester, they perform, usually by memory, for a jury. And they'll have been playing by memory in studio classes and master classes through the semester as well. So here's the problem. This just doesn't align with professional reality. For the most part, professionals never would dream of playing repertoire from memory after only knowing it for a few months. Of course, there's exceptions, but for the most part, that's just not the way it works. Neither would they expect to have fully formed, mature interpretations. I hear top-tier professional musicians like Stephen Huff, for example, who I really admire. He's a wonderful thinker, wonderful pianist, and he said quite honestly that he leaves at least 1 year for a major work or concerto before he tries playing it in public. And from that, you really get an impression of how much time is really required before memory is going to feel secure under pressure. And I think that's really the key. Everything changes under pressure. Andras Schiff even said that he spent like 3 or 4 years before he even, tried to perform the Goldberg variations in public. So taking aside the issue of whether it's necessary or not to memorize for concert performance, because there are lots of opinions on this, the kind of time span that's really necessary to feel totally comfortable with memory was never made clear to me in the university environment. It was always about learning new rep as quickly as possible, memorizing as quickly as possible, and performing immediately. This, I guess, shouldn't be surprising. I mean, many of the professors also had problems performing by memory, and very rarely did so. There were very few teachers who made any concerted effort to play solo recitals by memory. I mean, they didn't really have to, and I don't blame them either. It's a very difficult thing to do with perfect accuracy, playing by memory in a concert. If you just think about how complicated a lot of piano music is. And it becomes exponentially harder the less time you have. So I think forcing yourself to memorize, as many people are made to do in music school, is a terrible thing. No student should have to do this. It leads inevitably to insecurity, self-doubt, stage fright, and a host of other mental ailments. It's also simply putting way too much pressure on developing artists. I've seen countless students, my peers and myself, who developed complexes about memory, convinced that they had faulty memories and were doomed to forget under pressure. I remember one colleague in my master's expressed how she had developed this kind of frightening self-talk. She'd be playing along and then suddenly she would think to herself, I don't know what the next note is. This would happen at unforeseen moments. She couldn't predict when it would happen. And it wasn't surprising to me, really, because her teacher was one of those that required all students to be memorized at the very first lesson. How could she avoid developing these kind of insecurities when she was constantly having to put a very fragile memory of a piece to the test under pressure again and again? You begin just developing these little cracks in your confidence. It's simply not the case that people have bad memories. I mean, generally, people can play naturally by memory fairly quickly. They just work on a piece for a long time and then they realize, I basically know it by memory. Of course, there's a lucky few who have incredibly quick and powerful natural abilities with recall, but those are few and far between. And you don't have to be a prodigy to be able to memorize just fine. The only issue is, of course, that students are forced to put this to the test very quickly. It's unhealthy, it's psychologically damaging, it needs to stop. Students should not be required to play new pieces by memory. Especially in these days of iPads and foot pedals, there's no excuse for keeping up with this antiquated standard. A student should only play by memory when they feel secure. Probably only once they've been studying a particular piece for at least a year, just like professionals tend to do. And by the way, this is very much in keeping with the practice of musicians from the 19th century when the whole standard of memory first started coming about. Liszt, for example, who was famous for playing by memory, he only played about half of his repertoire actually by memory. He frequently played with the score in concerts. Clara Schumann, who started this thing of playing entire recitals by memory, towards the end of her life, she stopped. She started playing with the score again. She just didn't feel as comfortable playing by memory anymore. But not only when you're old, though, even when you're younger, I think it still can be really beneficial to just use the score in performances sometimes. I think once this artificial standard is done away with, the students will find other benefits as well. Once you're not chained by the need to be memorized for every single piece all the time, you can really turn your attention to interpretation and understanding the music that you're playing and not just spitting out something that you've learned by rote. One time, one of my teachers mentioned that, since you know the piece by memory, you probably have never looked at the score for a long time or something, because I was not doing something written in the music, I think. And I realized it's true. Could you blame me? I was always required to play by memory for every performance. I wanted to make sure it was there, so I was doing most of my practicing by memory. But I realize now that when you're kind of forced to do this, it really alienates you from the composer's markings and finding a really true, deep interpretation. You miss a lot of things, and your playing becomes much more superficial when you have to always be memorized like that, especially under, short time pressure situations. So I've recovered, I think, from this kind of complex about memory. I have many thoughts about performing by memory and whether we should really even try to do it so much, but I'll deal with those in another video. I think I've raised enough controversial points for now. So please leave comments. I'd be very interested to hear your views on this subject. Again, my overall experience was a positive one going through music school, but there were definitely negative aspects as well that I see to the current day. And I'm interested in your perspective. So please do comment in addition to liking and subscribing and supporting the channel financially if you can. You can do that through my Patreon account, www.patreon.com/independentpianist, or I have a link to my PayPal account in the description box if you want to use that. Also, please do consider studying with me online. I'm going to also do a video about online teaching soon, but online teaching is really exciting and I think a really wonderful opportunity that we have to connect with teachers that we might not otherwise get to work with. So I love working with students in this way, and I think I have some good systems that really work for helping people to improve. So you can consider doing that. Just drop me an email at cole@independentpianist.com if you want to schedule a consultation. And other than that, just stay tuned until next time. We'll have some more great music next week. But until then, this is Cole Anderson signing off.